Hi, Coburn. Welcome to. I'm very glad sitting down with you to discuss some of the things that we have been working on for a while. I was very excited when you joined as the advisor, and now I'm even more super excited and grateful that you decided to take on a larger role within Vigrid. And welcome.
All
Welcome.
right, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited as well. Appreciate it.
So let's start by breaking down for the audience what is security by design, what are we espousing here, and what some of the initiatives that you had taken previously in all your previous roles uh, that our audience would find useful to
Sure,
understand
sure.
the. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, at the previous companies I've been at, where, arguably some of the largest public cloud workloads, when you think about security, the majority of security was owned by the CISO and sort of a peer in the organization that I worked with to ensure we had security in place. I would say, unfortunately, most of the time, security tends to be a bit of an afterthought. And so partnering with the organization, if you own infrastructure and your job is to ensure developers can deploy consistently and rapidly, the CISO is a great partner to work with. And in fact, in my organizations, the majority of our projects, the highest percentage of them that involve collaboration across teams were between my infrastructure and the security teams. And so from an initiative perspective,
Yeah.
uh, part of it was, as we look forward, sometimes you determine where your weaknesses are in the overall landscape. And so through the planning cycle, the initiative involves getting the teams together and getting that strategic roadmap in place to make sure that you prioritize it most often as a cross-org initiative, which is actually very challenging because you have to coordinate and compete with a bunch of other requirements in the environment, but you have to make it a first-class initiative. Like maybe this language has a vulnerability and it has to be replaced, and it's not optional to leave it as is. And so you have to really reverse your way into making things secure and compete against other current state product priorities. But that's how the initiatives were more clearly formalized to be on like a semester level basis.
Yeah. So given these initiatives and this background, what within the vision for how the platform uh, encapsulates or promotes or empowers secure by design kind of resonated with you?
Absolutely. So, much in the infrastructure and security space at the previous companies I was at, you really want to sort of lower the operational bar for engineers. Most engineers you hire are not infrastructure specialists, they're not security specialists. And when they have to spend time focusing on that, not only does it distract them from what you hired them to build, which is typically product features, but it's often done inconsistently, and it's sort of at a risk to the organization. So I think the vision is, how do you make many aspects of a developer's life um, no lift, right? We call it undifferentiated heavy lifting, which is by default, if you deploy with this tool, we're going to be, making sure the environments are safe, making sure you have guardrails around deployment. So in the infrastructure pace, you might have continuous delivery with rollback and canary analysis. And so really the goal is to get out of the way of the engineer, because there's very few engineers you hire outside of your security team who want to spend their days dealing with security. And part of this involves putting the systems in place to make sure they don't have to worry about it. And if they do get notified something's wrong with security or infrastructure, they'll receive a notification, but otherwise don't bother them, right? And I think that was the vision is, and that's one of the challenges too, right? Is when you're in organizations where your success is measured by the absence of failure. Sometimes when you do a really good job, people say, I wonder if they were just lucky, or our infrastructure and security teams are really good. And we're like, no, we're really good, but it takes a lot of work to build that environment. And so I think that's the vision, is just get out of the way of the engineers.
Yeah, the engineers would want to always build the next coolest feature and the function and the next coolest solution, right? They don't want to be bothered with security, as you said, right?
That's right. And the cloud is exciting for engineers, right? And they come to a company that's cloud-based. They get excited when they deploy their first load balancer, like, look at that, I provisioned infrastructure. And then
Yeah.
they never want to deploy a load balancer again in their life. Like, that was fun, but let me go do the work I need to do. So
Right. Exactly. But is it always right? Like what circumstances does security by design is very apt? Are there certain points in time in the journey of the company where security by design works better than on other occasions? When does it give us the most bang for the buck?
of the companies, it's a good question. Of the companies I've been at, many of them have, established accounts that have been around for many years, and they have a fair amount of technical debt because oftentimes taking a large enterprise environment that hasn't been appropriately segmented, um, you end up having some technical debt there, and oftentimes vulnerabilities are exposed, and it becomes a little bit of a fire alarm going off, right? And everybody has to solve it. But what you do see is, I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly here, but as you get these new environments spinning up, like developers stand up environments and you put more standardization in place, there's less fire drills over time, right? But the goal is to get that big environment over time broken down into units where there are less fire drills in place. And
Yeah,
so I would say there's a combination of proactive and reactive.
yeah,
And it sort of depends on where you are in terms of your tooling and your landscape. And I think the more advanced you can be, and we've talked a lot about how important landing zones are as a cloud concept. I think if every company who was on the cloud could push a magic button and have landing zones, everybody would sleep better at night.
yeah,
And not everybody's there, but I
right.
think if you can move to that space, it makes it more proactive, and then it just doesn't become a problem.
Right, right. So even if there is a mess around, and you perfectly said, right, break it down into units and then go gradually, you can go to a state where it is secure by design, right? So
Absolutely, yeah.
so what are some of the challenges though in this? Like as uh I mean, it's not really easy, right? Teams have to come together, right? We are doing with our platform trying to bring them together, but what challenges do you perceive in this journey?
I think just like when my experience in the infrastructure space where we tried to get people to increase velocity, right? There's the whole argument of if you push more quickly, you're going to break things. And the goal is to put mechanisms in place that allow people to do things more rapidly without breaking them. And I think security also falls in the category of if I do it well, it's going to slow me down. And so by default, there's pushback on security initiatives, right? And so um, I think the challenge is how do you change the mindset
Yeah,
so that people realize being secure by design doesn't have to slow down your engineering velocity.
right.
And people tend to, there's a syndrome called fade effect bias, which means that when you have bad experiences, you tend to forget about them more quickly than good experiences. So we look back and we're like, oh, that gigantic outage we had last year, you sort of forget about it until it happens again, right? And so people sort of tend to forget about the risks that surface as
Mm,
they move ahead. And, it's unfortunate that they have to be reminded by having another outage or vulnerability or something that's exposed.
mm,
But I think it is important that, the CTO and the CISO have an aligned message because oftentimes you have a friction in prioritization. The security person who owns security has their backlog of work with their vision. The CTO has their backlog of work and where they want to go with the platform and the infrastructure. And when you take those two individuals and you get them aligned on something, it's very easy to win an argument around funding and prioritization, right? I've rarely seen cases where, the CISO and the CTO agree on something and there isn't unanimous support across the executive technical team, right? So I do think one of the challenges is when there's all this work going on, it's very reactive. And the people who are in charge of platform and infrastructure and the people in charge of security don't combine forces, right? Like it's a common space, and we've talked about that a bit. When we say there's friction between the CTO and the CISO, it's not personal friction like I don't like you, you don't like me. It's we have our priorities. And what's interesting is in that Venn diagram, there's a big overlap space where, as the person who owned infrastructure at a couple companies, my job was to make the CISO happy, right? Like if I'm building a new system to modernize deployment or abstract infrastructure out, what if I could just get security requirements in there? And so the challenge is, I think, to have engineering leaders who are forward looking enough that it's that old saying, like we can, move fast alone or move farther together. And I think the challenge in this space is infrastructure and security need to move together. And even though at times it might feel a little bit slower, it's two birds with one stone. You end up in a better, more secure solution, and you look back and you go, "Wow, that was really great time we invested to move farther together." Right.
Right, right. That is an African proverb, right? Around that. You
Right.
run fast, you run alone. You want to run further, you run
Run
together.
together. That's right. Yeah. So I think that's the challenge is, do you see those two organizations as being able to align and solve the problem more effectively?
Right.
Or are they going to remain siloized and infrastructure lays something down, the security team has to go and figure out how to bolt something on after the fact? And it's not that comfortable to have to be an afterthought.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. So once we know that the CTOs and CISOs are on the same, have security as a priority. Once that is sorted out and is at least one of the priorities amongst all the list of, getting the functionality out, deploying and shipping the product out. Along with that, keeping all the data that we'll get as a result of that secure is one of the listed priorities, and everyone is in agreement of that. Uh, what next beyond that? How do we empower them? How do we empower each other? Because security is, stating the priority is a start, but beyond that, it can't be left to chance, right? It has to be designed in. So there's a lot of hard work that has to actually go in. And one of the things we are trying to solve it, of course, by empowering the two teams to make that happen. What do you, how do you perceive that what in your opinion is the next step beyond, yes, we are aligned that this is a priority. How do they actually make it happen?
I think much of it depends on sort of the state of the company and where the junctures exist to make that sort of change, right? If you're a large established enterprise, you're on the cloud, you have a really gigantic environment where production is, and you're thinking, how do we move to that point where we can prove this out? I
Yeah.
often have seen people when they talk about cloud migration, like let's go from the data center to the cloud.
Mm.
Um, and there's a bunch of people in a company that oftentimes fight back against that. And not uncommon, it's sometimes the people that run the data centers, and they say, well, the cloud can't handle our biggest workload or our biggest database. And it's like, well, you don't know that, but you probably wouldn't be doing yourself a service if you tried to move your largest, most demanding workload first. I'll give you an example, which was, I was at a company, Amazon introduced VPC. We had been on EC2 Classic with hundreds of thousands of instances, and they said, okay, EC2 Classic is going away. And so it'll put a little bit of fear in you, right? Like, oh my God, we have this gigantic system that's serving hundreds of millions of customers. How can I move it and change the network architecture? So we came up with the methodology that said, hey, we have to do this. So in this case, it was a forced move.
Mm.
But what we did is we took our workloads and we said, okay, let's break them into 4 categories. There's going to be small workloads and large workloads, and there's going to be low criticality workloads and high criticality workloads. So as we're proving out this functionality, let's start with the small non-critical. Then let's do the large non-critical. Then we'll do the small critical and the large critical. So by the time you reach the workloads in your business that are super critical, you've already proven out the methodology. So I think to your question, once the CTO and the CTO and the CISO agree on like, hey, we want to do this,
Yeah.
you're probably not best saying, let's go try to replumb and rebuild all of our enterprise environment.
Right.
get it working in your test and staging and prod. And one thing I had mentioned to you was it's very often in companies that they'll have a large production account, and over time, as security requirements get larger, they realize we shouldn't have that data sitting in that account. We need to go build another account. And so I don't know how many names of projects I'm aware of involving decomposition of a production account into smaller accounts. But usually when a company decides to do that, it's very hectic. There's a lot of cycles spent. And how do we reverse engineer this? How do we make sure that we rebuild the VPC and the load balancers and do the peering correctly? I think if you can take those needs, and that's just one category, is large enterprise that need to decompose their environments.
Yeah.
Another one might be a small startup that stamps out SaaS environments. Prove it out, take it into an environment, look at the architecture, stamp it out. Everybody has gaps in their architectures. If I go to two different companies, they're going to have different tool chains, but at the cloud foundation, they probably have a similar set of characteristics. They have networks, they have gateways, they have peering, they have compute, they have containers and orchestration. So my suggestion would be, take the product, identify an appropriately scoped, POC,
Yeah.
prove it out. And one of the benefits of really even proving this out in a smaller environment is that as developers and teams move their code from development through test, through staging or integration and into production, you're applying consistent security controls through them, because I've seen many times where team goes off and develops an application or a new microservice. And when they get to production, it breaks. It won't run whatsoever. And it's because in the development environment, they went and modified a bunch of firewall rules, or they went and modified a bunch of routing policies. And then they got to production and realized, oh, I can't do that. So I think if you consider how you can apply it and proof it, do it in a way where it delivers high value, even earlier in the development chain. And you're just going to find that sort of benefit propagate its way up through all your environments. So I think that's the type of plan. I tend to, having owned reliability at some of these companies as well, I tend to take a little bit of a risk averse. Like, I really don't want to take the site down. So how can I structure the project to be most effective? And I think, with what we're building as a product, there's a huge amount of opportunity to prove it out and get some road testing on it in environments, and then just use it to stamp things out going forward.
What a fantastic idea, Coburn. I mean, that's what we are doing with a couple of customers, but I think you have said it so well, articulated it so well. Decompose it, try it in the dev, scope it out, and then gradually move, to your larger, riskier workloads.
Right. You might even be in a situation where, and I've done this at a couple companies, where for the purposes of availability, right, you might have to deploy your application and workloads across multiple cloud regions, sometimes multiple cloud providers. And if you have this ability to build out secured environments from scratch, how much more confidence do you have? Because at some point you're going to have to rebuild something or decompose something.
Yeah, very true. And on that note, I think we can end today's session. Fabulous. Wonderful talking to you.
Yeah, well, looking forward to where we go with the product. And I think it solves a lot of pain points I've had historically, and I hope that other companies find the value in that as well.
Yeah, let's go change the world one thing at a time. One customer.
That's right. That's right.